This is Ethics, Lecture 1. Now that you've read part of the Euthyphro, you've had your first encounter with Socrates. And in the normal lecture class, I usually like to begin and ask, so how would you like to get into an argument with Socrates? I think the usual reaction to that is no way, and there's probably good reason for that. It's not clear whether Socrates is a friend or a foe. He comes across as someone who is on your side. He wants to learn, and he asks you questions. But then the questions he asks and where you always end up isn't necessarily a friendly place. You will probably end up at some point in time finding yourself at the losing end of an argument with Socrates. As most of you probably know, Socrates ended up being executed, being tried for not believing in the gods of Athens and for corrupting the youth. And in fact, Socrates was on his way to his trial when he ran across Euthyphro. And Euthyphro himself was on his way to trial as well. He was bringing charges against his father. And this is actually what Socrates found quite surprising, because as it turns out, as you'll read, that Euthyphro had charged his father for the murder of a slave, but the slave had also committed murder. And so Euthyphro's father had tied him up and had gone off to do whatever he needed to do to find out how to take care of this slave, but while he was gone, the slave had died. And so Euthyphro ended up charging his father with the murder of this slave. But it's surprising to Socrates because I think in that day and age, this would not have been seen as such a terrible thing. And so because it was surprising, Socrates felt that Euthyphro must have some sort of special knowledge about what is just. Because if you think about it, when you go out and do what you think is right, and you think that what you're doing is the thing you need to do, you have some standard in mind that justifies and validates what it is you're doing. And because of Euthyphro's surprise to Socrates, Socrates assumed he must know. And in fact, in the readings, and I'm going to use the numbers on the side of the text just in case we ever end up using a different edition, but this is going to be at 4e. Socrates says, "But heavens above, Euthyphro, do you think you have such exact knowledge of religion, of things holy and unholy? Is it so exact that in the circumstance you describe, you aren't afraid that, by bringing your father to trial, you might prove guilty of unholy conduct yourself?" So in other words, Socrates is surprised by Euthyphro and thinking that Euthyphro must really know what he's doing to be doing the right thing rather than the wrong thing. So this leads us then to one of the main themes in Plato's dialogues, and one of the main themes in the Euthyphro, and that is the question about knowledge versus opinion. This is going to be a theme that pops up in most of the Platonic dialogues. It will also pop up in the Republic, as we'll see when we get to that a little bit later. But first off, the question to ask is, what counts as knowledge? And in the Euthyphro, that becomes a matter of what counts as knowledge of holiness. In other words, what does Euthyphro really know that justifies his bringing his charges against his father? Now, right off the bat, we can see that what it isn't for Socrates is a list of facts. It's not a list of facts that Socrates is looking for. So, in fact, picking up with the text, this is going to be over at 6e. Euthyphro has listed a number of facts or said a number of things that he thinks are examples of holiness. But then Socrates says, "And do you recall that I wasn't urging you to teach me about one or two of those many things that are holy, but rather about the form itself, whereby all holy things are holy? Because you said, I think, that it was by virtue of a single character that unholy things are unholy and holy things are holy. Don't you remember?" In other words, there is a single form or truth to holiness, and everything that is holy because of that single form or essence of holiness. So that it's that objective form or truth that Socrates will count as knowledge. And a key aspect of this is that everything that has that form or participates in that form is going to be holy. So the question then is, what is this form itself, whereby all holy things are holy? In other words, in the list of examples, A, B, C, D, E, etc., that one might give of holiness or beauty, of justice, etc., what is the form that all those particular examples have in common? Now, the standard procedure that Socrates engages in with people as he's trying to find out this knowledge is he's trying to separate knowledge from opinion. So knowledge is going to be what one has when one knows these forms. And opinion will be what one takes to be the case, but may not be the case. In other words, one may turn out to be wrong about what is the case. And that will be an opinion. And as we'll see with the Euthyphro, and is what happens in all the other dialogues as well, is that as Socrates discusses these questions with people, they all end up being shown to have an opinion about a particular subject, but not knowledge. And it's knowledge that Socrates is looking for. So how does he go about trying to get this knowledge? Well, the general approach, as it's come to be called, is the Socratic method. Now, of course, Socrates didn't call it the Socratic method. It's named in his honor or in recognition of his contributions to Western thought. But what Socrates would do, he would hang out in the agora or the marketplace of Athens, where all the shopping and well-to-dos would often hang out and spend their time and days. And Socrates would engage in conversations and discussions with people. So as we'll see with Euthyphro, he's engaged with Euthyphro in a discussion about what is holy. In other words, what is the standard that Euthyphro is using as a justification for bringing charges against his father? In other words, how does he know he's not doing the wrong thing? One fundamental assumption for Socrates is that truth is non-contradictory. So if I were to ask you, what is the sum of 2 plus 2? And you were to know the answer to that, and you would say 4. You wouldn't later on come along and say, actually, no, it's 5. You would not, in other words, contradict your initial answer. The truth is what it is and cannot be anything different or other. Opinions, however, can be other. In other words, I might like a movie, but then later on decide I don't like it, or vice versa. Our opinions are constantly changing, and that's a fairly standard and normal aspect of opinions. But knowledge, at least knowledge of the forms that Socrates is looking for, are non-contradictory. In other words, they are not a matter of opinion. So what Socrates does then is he starts talking with people about what they take to know, assuming, and this is where Socratic irony comes in, because the question is, how much does he really assume? But he's charitable, I suppose you could say, and he's assuming for the sake of argument or for the sake of pleasant conversation that Euthyphro does indeed know what makes something holy. And so if he does know, then Euthyphro will never contradict himself. Whatever answers he gives will be consistent with the truth that he knows. And so Socrates then begins to ask questions. And as eventually happens, and as you see, Euthyphro ends up contradicting himself. And whenever one contradicts themselves, then that is evidence for Socrates that they did not have knowledge, but rather opinion. Because in opinion, we allow for contradictions. In fact, we'll even say, well, everyone's entitled to their own opinion, meaning that their opinion may be contradictory to mine, but they're entitled to it. I'm not going to dispute their opinion. I'll let them have their opinion. But we wouldn't say that someone who says 2 plus 2 is 5 is entitled to that opinion. We wouldn't take that to be something that is a matter of opinion. Similarly for Socrates with the truth that he's looking for. It is not a matter of opinion. And the Socratic method, as it's come to be known, is a way of trying to weed out opinions by way of revealing contradictions. And science, in much the same way, progresses by revealing contradictions to hypotheses. So when a scientific hypothesis or theory ends up with a contradiction, then the new contradictory evidence needs to be accounted for. Now, sometimes you can say it was a mistake and that evidence isn't real, but if it is real evidence, then theory will generally have to progress and move in order to encompass it. Famous example is when Rutherford's experiments showed that light was not a particle, which that result contradicted Newtonian theory, and the result of that was a new theory of physics, quantum physics, which came along. And history of science is filled with examples like this. And so Socrates, in many ways, is the beginning of this type of intellectual pursuit and investigation. One of the reasons why Socrates is seen as such a pivotal figure and why the philosophers that came before Socrates are all kind of lumped together as pre-Socratics. So now we can turn to the Euthyphro itself and to Euthyphro's definition of what makes something holy. And as Euthyphro says, holiness is what is agreeable to the gods is holy. Now, as you know, there wasn't one god in the Greek view or in the Greek religion. There were a pantheon of gods, as the picture in this slide shows. And that immediately brings up a question that Socrates asks. And Socrates' response, which is at 7b in the reading, Socrates says this: well, on what matters do their differences produce hostility and anger? In other words, sometimes the gods, imagine the gods in this picture, do they always agree with one another? And the question is, what are the types of things that they won't agree on? So let's look at it this way, Socrates goes on. If we differed, you and I, about which of two things was more numerous, would our difference on these questions make us angry and hostile towards one another, or would we resort to counting in such disputes, and soon be rid of them? Euthyphro: we certainly would. Socrates: again, if we differed about which was larger and smaller, we'd soon put an end to our difference by resorting to measurement, wouldn't we? Euthyphro: that's right. Socrates: and we would decide a dispute about which was heavier and lighter, presumably by resorting to weighing. Euthyphro: of course. Socrates: then what sorts of questions would make us angry and hostile towards one another if we differed about them and were unable to reach a decision? Perhaps you can't say offhand, but consider my suggestion that there are questions of what is just and unjust, honorable and dishonorable, good and bad. Aren't those the matters in which our disagreement and our inability to reach a satisfactory decision occasionally make enemies of us, of you and me, and of people in general? So a result of this is that it's precisely questions of holiness and justice and goodness where not only people but these gods themselves will disagree. And in a circumstance where one god is pleased by a particular action and another god not pleased, or he doesn't find an action agreeable, then the same action will both be holy and unholy. And as I said earlier, the truth can't be contradictory, and so that wouldn't be the proper answer. So Euthyphro is immediately led into a contradiction. It can't be what is agreeable to the gods that is holy, at least not as initially defined. And Euthyphro comes back with a revision, which is fairly common, and we see this all the time. You come up with an initial idea, you find a problem, contradiction, area where it doesn't work, you come back and fix it, you revise it. The Rutherford experiment and the revision of physics to expand and become quantum physics is an example. So Euthyphro's revision is the holy is whatever all the gods love. So all the gods in that picture then would have to agree. And if they agreed, then we could say that it is holy. So at this point in time, we might say, okay, well, good. Euthyphro has finally come up with a solid definition of what makes something holy. But as you know, at this point, this is not how things work for Socrates. And this is where there's a turning point in the reading. And there's a particular passage from the Euthyphro that I want to read. It's passage 10c, the fairly long paragraph where Socrates says this to Euthyphro. And it's a passage that on the surface is pretty complex, but it's very, very important. So Socrates says this: Then someone does not see a thing because it is in a state of being seen, but on the contrary, it is in that state because someone is seeing it. Nor does someone lead a thing because it is in a state of being led, but rather it is in that state because someone is leading it. Nor does someone carry a thing because it is in a state of being carried, but it is in that state because someone is carrying it. Is my meaning quite clear, Euthyphro? What I mean is this: if something gets into a certain state or is affected in a certain way, it does not get into that state because it possesses it. Rather, it possesses that state because it gets into it, nor is it thus affected because it is in that condition. Rather, it is in that condition because it is thus affected. Don't you agree with that? Euthyphro: Yes, I do. Again, being loved is a case of either being in a certain state or being in a certain condition because of some agent. Euthyphro: Certainly. So in other words, let's say the condition of being loved. Is that because of something you possess that makes you being loved, or is it because of something someone else is doing? As is the case for Socrates here, it's because of something someone else is doing that makes you in a state of being loved. Similarly, it's because someone is carrying you or carrying something that it's in a state of being carried, or it's because someone is leading you that you're in a state of being led. So, if, for example, you're in a state of unrequited love, there's someone that you really love or like and wish they loved you, there's nothing you can do to put yourself in the state of being loved. The only way you can be in a state of being loved is if that person turns out to love you. Well, this brings up an issue or a particular problem with respect to the state of holiness, because how has Euthyphro defined holiness? He's defined holiness as that which the gods love. But the question then is it holiness because the gods love it, or do the gods love it because it is holy? In other words, and this is the key point for Socrates, the reason the gods love it, and he gets Euthyphro to recognize this as well, is precisely because it is holy or good. But then that's not how Euthyphro defined holiness. He defined holiness as that which the gods love, which doesn't tell us anything about holiness itself. It just tells us that this is something the gods love. And this brings us up to an important point about Plato's theory of forms. First off, the forms are objective. So an example that I like to think of is the cliche, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. It isn't the case that beauty is simply something that you see as beautiful that makes it beautiful. That's what the cliche says, that because I see it as beautiful, it is beautiful. That is not Plato's theory. Plato's theory is basically that I see it as beautiful because it is beautiful. So holiness or the forms are objective realities or truths. It isn't the case that one likes something and that liking it makes it good. It's liked because it is good. So that's one aspect of the theory of forms. They are objective realities or truths. They aren't dependent upon what we think or say. In fact, we may be entirely wrong about what is beautiful, just, or holy. But what is just or holy is true and real, irregardless of what we happen to think about it. The other thing that we've seen is that the forms are non-contradictory, but that also means that they're unchanging. Because anytime something changes, it entails becoming something it is not. In other words, it entails a contradiction with what it is right now. So if it's truly non-contradictory, it can never change. So the form of beauty always is what it will be. Whoever might be considered beautiful, whatever artworks might be considered beautiful, whatever thing might be considered just or good, those things may come and go, but the forms themselves are eternal and unchanging. So this is basically kind of where we come to at the end of the Euthyphro. And as we turn now to the Republic, we can begin to see that this theory of the forms as a kind of absolute leads us into one of the important themes of the Republic. And I'll just sort of get this started in this lecture. And in the next lecture, we'll go through the rest of the Republic. The Republic, like the Euthyphro, begins with the question of what is justice. Just as in the case of the Euthyphro, the question is what is holiness. In this particular case, it's a question of what is justice. And there are two people at the beginning that offer an answer to this question. The first is Cephalus. Cephalus claims that justice is, quote, to speak the truth and give back what one has taken from another. Now, this might seem like a decent definition of justice, but then Socrates immediately asks, well, what about a case where a person who is lent a gun is then asks for it back, or actually a person who lends you a gun asks for it back when they're not in their right mind, they're suicidal or something like that. Clearly, it wouldn't be right to give it back to them then in that circumstance. In other words, what if someone, if in order to save someone's life, you're put in a situation where you might need to lie? Would it be just to tell the truth in that circumstance? It seems not. So because there's an exception, then we don't have an absolute. We don't have a universal, non-contradictory truth. So Cephalus's definition of justice doesn't stand up. Then we get to Polemarchus, and Polemarchus says some interesting things, and pay close attention to this as you go through the reading. First, Polemarchus says that just is to restore to each man what is his due. And basically what he is saying is that you give good to those who are good and harm to those who are bad. Basically, we punish our enemies or people who do us or the state harm, and we reward to the extent that we can those who do good and so on. But then the question then becomes, well, what if we are mistaken? What if we think a friend is a friend when they're truly not, and vice versa? What if we take someone not to be a friend when they really are? Then we may very well end up doing harm to our friends and good to our enemies, which would then be contradictory and wouldn't be just. Polemarchus then revises, kind of like Euthyphro did, and says, well, then we punish the deeds themselves, the actual things that were bad. And then that leads to a discussion of whether it is ever just for a person to do harm to another. And the key point to get from this discussion is that when they're talking about doing harm, what is it that's being harmed? If you're harming a horse, you're harming the horse's ability to do what horses do. But when you're harming a human being, the key thing that's being harmed, at least in this discussion, is our capacity to be just or good. And that leads one to remember that what differentiates humans from non-humans for Plato and much of Western thought is that we have the capacity to be moral. So in this context then, if one harms another, then what one is doing is one is making a just person less just or less capable of being moral. But why would a good person ever make someone less good? That would seem to be contradictory. So even though the conclusion that he reaches there might not seem one that we might generally agree with, the general theory or idea behind it that we are human and what makes us human is to be moral is, I think, the key component there. So they go through those discussions, and then at this point, Thrasymachus breaks into the conversation. And this is the last thing that I really want to talk about for this particular lecture. And this is in the Republic. It's at 336b. And I'll just read this passage. While we were still in the middle of our discussion, Thrasymachus was, more than once, bent on interrupting the conversation with objections. But he was checked on each occasion by those who sat by, who wished to hear the argument out. However, when I had made this last remark, and we had come to a pause, he could restrain himself no longer. But, gathering himself up like a wild beast, he sprang upon us, as if he would tear us in pieces. I and Polemarchus were terrified and startled, while Thrasymachus, raising his voice to the company, said, "What nonsense has possessed you and Polemarchus all this time, Socrates? And why do you play the fool together, submitting to one another? No, if you really wish to understand what justice is, Do not confine yourself to asking questions and making a display of refuting the answers that are returned, for you are aware that it is easier to ask questions than to answer them. But give us an answer also yourself, and tell us what you assert justice to be, and do not answer me by defining it as the obligatory, or the advantageous, or the profitable, or the lucrative, or the expedient. But whatever your definition may be, let it be clear and precise, for I will not accept your answer if you talk such trash as that. So, in essence, Thrasymachus is calling Socrates out. He's basically accusing Socrates if it's easy to criticize, it's easy to challenge someone else's answer. It's much harder to come up with an answer yourself. And my guess is Thrasymachus expresses a fairly common view of people's reactions to Socrates. Remember what happened to Socrates in the end, right? He ended up being executed. And Thrasymachus will also have a very pretty much a common sense or realistic view of justice as well. And that's exactly what happens in the remaining sections of this book of the Republic, that Socrates gets Thrasymachus to talk about his conception of justice. But that will be what we will talk about for the next lecture. That's it for this lecture.